The streets whispered that if you crossed Tony Accardo, also known as Joe Batters, you'd end up breathing through a plastic tube under 6 feet of fresh concrete. But what the FBI found inside the frozen trunks in the winter of 1978 proved that the legends were actually too merciful. In February 1978, Chicago Police Department detectives pried open the trunk of an abandoned sedan, buried deep within a frozen snowbank on the city's outskirts. Inside, they discovered the body of Vincent Moretti. The scene was grim. Moretti bore the brutal, unmistakably violent marks of severe physical trauma and deep lacerations across his torso. Yet, it was not the trauma itself that paralyzed the veteran forensic team on the scene. It was the unnatural state of the human tissue. The body was so thoroughly, densely frozen by the bitter Illinois winter elements that Cook County medical examiners repeatedly bent their stainless steel needles, simply trying to draw an initial baseline blood sample for toxicology. The subsequent formal autopsy revealed a timeline that completely disrupted the state's investigation. Moretti, along with his closest criminal associate John Mendel, had not merely succumbed to the natural elements of an open-air Chicago blizzard. The physical evidence pointed towards something far more structured. They had been systematically hunted down, trapped, and slowly brutalized by an elite West Side enforcement crew, a territory operating under the direct, unquestioned control of Anthony Accardo. For decades, investigators and mob historians have debated Accardo's underlying motive in ordering a response of this magnitude. To understand Accardo is to understand that he never operated on raw emotion. Informants later suggested to the FBI that the extreme condition of the bodies was part of a cold, calculated exercise in forensic manipulation. The theory was that if the victims were brutally mutilated and subsequently left exposed to a controlled, sub-zero draft before being dumped into the unpredictable winter weather of Illinois, the extreme crystallization of the cellular structures would entirely deny science its critical post-mortem thermal window. Whether this was a premeditated plan or simply the byproduct of a brutal Chicago winter, the result was a defensive shield that threatened to break the back of a federal homicide investigation. Without an accurate, scientifically verifiable hour of death, the federal government would find it utterly impossible to dismantle the ironclad alibis of his primary executioners. The fatal error that ultimately placed these independent operators in the immediate crosshairs of the Chicago outfit occurred at precisely 2 o'clock in the morning on January 6th, just weeks prior to the discovery in the snowbank. Taking strategic advantage of a known window of vulnerability, specifically the fact that Tony Accardo was away from Illinois, vacationing at his high-security winter estate in Palm Springs, California, John Mendel orchestrated what he believed would be the score of a lifetime. Mendel was not a common street thug. He was an expert tradesman within the criminal underworld, a master thief who specialized in high-end commercial safes. Armed with a specialized water-cooled, diamond-tipped industrial drill, Mendel methodically cored out the high-security lock cylinder, protecting the side entrance of Accardo's massive stone-walled mansion in the affluent suburb of River Forest. Mendel had spent months studying the layout. He knew precisely how to map the interior and bypass the sophisticated, pressure-sensitive floor sensors designed to protect the main entryway and the central corridors. The initial objective of the plan was straightforward, clean, and immensely lucrative. Infiltrate the subterranean concrete vault, crack the primary safe, and secure a massive cache of personal jewelry, a collection of rare gold coins, and an estimated $3 million in untraceable street cash stashed away inside. But as Mendel's heavily hooded flashlights cut through the pitch black of Accardo's private first-floor study, underworld lore suggests the scope of the burglary shifted instantly. While searching for additional keys to the vault compartments, his hands forced open a hidden drawer within a deep, heavy mahogany desk. Early FBI theories and persistent street rumors long whispered that Mendel had discovered 3 black, leather-bound ledger books containing the secret, unredacted payrolls of the Chicago outfit, documenting the real names, specific cash amounts, and recurring transaction dates for 12 local district judges, 3 high-ranking police commanders, and 2 sitting United States senators. While the existence of these political ledgers remains a matter of intense historical debate, the bleak reality for the thieves was far more pragmatic. Mendel had stolen Accardo's private, highly prized personal wealth. In the unyielding mathematics of the Chicago outfit, this theft was not merely a financial loss. It was an existential insult to the chairman's absolute authority. Mendel believed he had secured a multi-million-dollar insurance policy that would make him permanently untouchable by both the law and the syndicate. He bypassed the remainder of the physical currency, slid the heavy haul into a canvas duffel bag, and signaled his crew to pull back into the night. What Mendel failed to realize, however, was that the ultimate security of that river forest estate did not rely on the physical wiring of the alarms he had so carefully deactivated. The true security lay in human habits and absolute loyalty. At precisely 8 o'clock that morning, a mere 6 hours after the thieves had departed, a highly trusted long-term domestic employee named Michael Volpe entered the residence via the service door to perform his daily routine of collecting the morning mail and inspecting the property. Volpe walked into the study and immediately noticed the splintered wood around the mahogany desk and the total absence of the confidential properties. Volpe did not panic, and he did not make the mistake of notifying the local River Forest Police Department. Instead, he walked to a secure location and placed a single, 3-minute long-distance call to a specific public phone booth located near a golf course in Palm Springs. When Tony Accardo received the detailed report on the other end of the line, his demeanor never fractured. His voice remained at its trademark, flat, conversational level. He did not issue threats, and he did not demand immediate vengeance. He simply mobilized the Wild Bunch, the outfit's premier, ultra-violent enforcement squad, reserved strictly for matters that threatened the survival of the administration. The directive Accardo issued from California was brief, clinical, and absolute, an order that internal FBI files would later summarize as a mandate to recover the stolen property and leave no witnesses standing. The first piece of the apparatus to fall was John Mendel. On January 15th, a mere 9 days following the burglary, Mendel was walking down a quiet side street in the working-class neighborhood of Cicero. There was no dramatic exchange of gunfire, no chaotic public scene that would draw the attention of passing patrol cars. Neighbors later informed field agents from the FBI that Mendel appeared to step almost voluntarily into the rear door of a clean, dark-colored sedan that had pulled smoothly alongside the curb. In truth, Mendel had not gone willingly out of compliance. He had gone out of sheer terror. The moment the rear window rolled down, he recognized the faces staring back at him from the front seat. These were senior members of the Wild Bunch, operating under the immediate personal supervision of Accardo's most feared street heavy, a seasoned outfit executioner named James Inandino. Mendel was not killed on the street, nor was he taken to a remote ditch. The crew required information that a quick bullet could never extract. They needed the exact, unmonitored location of the stolen assets and his accomplices. They transported him under heavy restraint to a commercial truck repair garage, located in a heavily industrialized sector of Chicago's West Side. The building was perfect for their purposes, insulated, noisy enough to drown out anomalies, and completely controlled by syndicate front companies. According to subsequent highly confidential depositions obtained from government-protected informants years later, Accardo's enforcers secured Mendel's hands flat inside a heavy-duty industrial bench, vice-bolted to a steel workstation. The Wild Bunch operated with the cold, mechanical precision of factory workers on a shift. They did not shout demands, and they did not engage in theatrical interrogation. They simply turned the heavy iron vice handle, crushing the delicate metatarsal and carpal bones in Mendel's hands in place. Millimeter by millimeter, they would turn the iron bar, wait for the agonizing shock to pass, and then ask for an address. Mendel's criminal resolve broke entirely within the first hours of this systematic torture. Under extreme physical duress, he surrendered everything. He confessed to Inandino that the stolen assets were no longer in his direct possession. They had been transferred to Vincent Moretti and Donald Reno. Mendel revealed that the secondary pair was already panicking, realizing the heat the theft had generated, and were actively planning to use their leverage to either blackmail the outfit administration for a massive exit payout or sell information directly to the United States Department of Justice in exchange for immediate placement in the Federal Witness Protection Program. That very same night, operating on the precise coordinates extracted from the garage floor, the Wild Bunch raided a nondescript apartment and successfully recovered Accardo's stolen gold coins and cash. Tony Accardo's primary objective had been achieved within days. The physical wealth was recovered, and the authority of the outfit had been reestablished. But within the logic of the Chicago outfit, a completed objective did not mean the contract was closed. The second half of Accardo's directive remained absolute, functioning as an unalterable law of survival. Leave no loose ends. For an administrator like Accardo, leaving men like Moretti, Reno, or Mendel alive, inside a federal holding cell, where they could eventually trade their knowledge of the outfit's operations for a reduced sentence or immunity, was an entirely unacceptable corporate liability. The organization could tolerate a loss, but it could never tolerate a potential witness. Days later, on a dark, ice-slick stretch of highway connecting Chicago to the northern suburbs, Vincent Moretti's vehicle was aggressively forced off the road by two trailing vehicles. Before Moretti or Reno could reach for the weapons hidden beneath their dashboards, they found themselves staring into the business end of 12-gauge pump shotguns, held by men wearing heavy wool masks. They did not know it at that moment, but their fates had already been sealed at the lowest possible temperature. Vincent Moretti, Donald Reno, and the remnants of the burglary crew were transported under cover of darkness to the secluded basement of an abandoned property located just off Cicero Avenue. It was down at the end of this damp, windowless concrete corridor that the Wild Bunch executed the final, most deliberate phase of the retaliation. The men were stripped of their heavy winter overcoats, isolating them from any residual warmth, and were subjected to a wave of calculated, systematic violence designed to ensure absolute compliance before death. Moretti's throat was severed from ear to ear with surgical precision. The others were systematically strangled with piano wire and stabbed to ensure total cessation of life. But the true mystery of this underworld execution was not the physical bloodletting. It was the staging and the preservation that followed. The killers did not rush to dispose of the evidence. Instead, the mutilated remains were left exposed to the brutal, sub-zero draft inside the facility before being transported. Informants would later whisper to federal agents that the bodies were kept in an artificial state of deep freeze, specifically to disrupt the forensics. Though skeptics argue it was merely a matter of logistical convenience for the disposal crew during a heavy blizzard, while the cleanup crew meticulously sanitized the basement floor with industrial solvents to ensure no traceable DNA remained. A much larger, far more dangerous complication was rapidly developing on the surface within the federal court system. A federal grand jury sitting in Chicago, which had already spent months probing the hidden financial infrastructure and labor racketeering of the outfit, caught wind of the River Forest burglary through street informants. Realizing the immense leverage this break-in could provide, federal prosecutors issued an emergency John Doe subpoena. The primary target of the state was Michael Volpe, a houseman who had first discovered the broken mahogany desk and placed the critical long-distance call to California. Volpe was an old-school, traditional loyalist who had spent decades serving the Accardo household, but federal prosecutors knew he represented a critical link in the chain of events. If the government could force Volpe to admit under oath, before a grand jury, that a major underworld figure's home had been breached, the Department of Justice would possess the leverage required to prove that Anthony Accardo was not a retired senior citizen, but was still operating as a central pillar of the most powerful criminal syndicate in the Midwest. It would utterly destroy his carefully cultivated public facade as a peaceful, law-abiding retiree. Volpe was aggressively escorted into the federal courthouse by U.S. Marshals. He took the witness stand before the grand jury, visibly shaken but composed, and following the strict, unyielding instructions of the syndicate's elite defense attorneys, invoked his Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination to every critical question. But for Tony Accardo, the mere fact that Volpe had crossed the threshold of a federal building, stood before a grand jury, and interacted with federal prosecutors turned the warning light from yellow to deep red. In Accardo's mathematical corporate universe, vulnerability was identical to treason, and suspicion was identical to guilt. Volpe's 30 years of unblemished quiet service evaporated the exact moment his name was entered onto the federal court docket. He had become a variable that could no longer be controlled with absolute certainty. 3 days after his forced appearance in court, Michael Volpe stepped out of his modest suburban residence to purchase a pack of cigarettes at a neighborhood corner store located just 2 blocks away. It was a mundane daily habit. He never made it to the counter. A dark sedan pulled silently alongside the curb. 2 men stepped out without drawing their weapons, and Volpe vanished from the face of the earth in broad daylight. His remains were never recovered from the drainage ditches, the limestone quarries, or the concrete highway foundations of Illinois. He was entirely, cleanly deleted from the historical record, a warning to anyone who believed that decades of service could buy mercy from the chairman. With the internal loose ends thoroughly, permanently tied up following Volpe's quiet disappearance, the Wild Bunch moved to complete the final stage of the forensic misdirection. The crew took the deeply frozen remains of Mendel, Moretti, and Reno out of the Cicero Avenue facility, distributed them into the trunks of separate stolen vehicles, and abandoned those cars in working-class, high-density neighborhoods during the height of one of the worst blizzards Chicago had seen in a decade. They knew the snow accumulation would keep the vehicles hidden from parking enforcement for weeks. Whether the Wild Bunch deliberately used the sub-zero draft of that Cicero facility as a calculated forensic weapon to distort the post-mortem timeline, or simply left the elements to do the work, the result remained identical. When detectives finally forced open the trunk of Moretti's stolen vehicle weeks later, after the snow began to thaw against the pavement, the forensic complications unfolded precisely as the underworld required. The pathologists and coroners at the Cook County morgue found themselves entirely paralyzed by the physical state of the evidence. Under normal, predictable circumstances, post-mortem lividity, rigor mortis, and cellular degradation allow trained medical examiners to pin down a window of death within a narrow margin of a few hours. This timeline is what allows detectives to break suspect stories and check alibis. But the deep freeze inside the facility, combined with the subsequent weeks spent inside a steel trunk during sub-zero outdoor weather, had created a perfect thermal barrier. The muscle tissue and internal organs had completely crystallized, stopping the biological clock of decomposition. The final official autopsy report had to register an open-ended, highly ambiguous estimate for the exact time of death, spanning an absurd 20-day margin of error. Without a definitive date and time to anchor the victim's final moments, federal prosecutors and homicide detectives were utterly unable to establish a functional timeline of the crime. They understood who the primary enforcement suspects were. They fully understood the underlying motive of the burglary retaliation, but every single prime suspect brought in for questioning presented legitimate, verified hotel receipts, commercial flight records, and documented business dinners in other states that covered every single day of that 20-day bracket. The completely destroyed forensic window nullified the government's homicide case before it could ever reach the desk of a prosecutor, let alone a courtroom. The case went cold, buried under the very same winter elements that had shielded the conspiracy. Tony Accardo passed away 14 years later, in May of 1992, at 86 years of age. He did not die in a prison hospital, and he did not die looking through a reinforced glass partition. He died of congestive heart failure in a comfortable, modern, climate-controlled hospital bed, surrounded by his children, his grandchildren, and his legitimate family. He remains to this day the only boss in the definitive history of American organized crime to command a multi-state criminal empire for 5 consecutive decades, without ever spending a single night behind the bars of a federal penitentiary. From the days of Al Capone and the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, all the way through the era of Las Vegas casino skimming, his record remained unblemished by a major conviction. He defeated the United States government and the FBI not by utilizing submachine guns, street warfare, or spectacular explosives in public venues, but by employing basic physics, the brutal, unyielding climate of Chicago, and absolute disciplined silence as his primary tools of risk management. He understood that the law was a machine built on timelines and evidence, and if you could freeze the timeline, the machine would tear itself apart. While the legendary black notebooks containing the names of suborned officials remain a staple of underworld folklore, the true secret Accardo protected was far simpler. The myth of his own retirement, the reality of what occurred during those cold days in January 1978 remained buried beneath the manicured lawns of River Forest, protected by the very same heavy, unbreakable silence that covered that grim hunt in the winter of 1978. If you appreciate true crime stories, consider subscribing to our channel. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next video.